The air inside the courthouse was thick with tension. As Judge Susan Whitmore strode down the long, echoing corridor, her heels clicked against the polished marble floors, each step a sharp disciplined note in a grim symphony of authority. She was known throughout the city as the epitome of justice, unyielding, unbending, and utterly merciless when it came to enforcing the law. Her black robe swirled around her ankles like a dark cloud, her steel-gray hair pulled back into a severe bun that seemed to pull the lines of her face even tighter. She had spent decades perfecting her reputation. In her eyes, compassion had no place in a courtroom. The law was a set of rules to be followed, not interpreted based on circumstance or pity. To her, justice was a cold, unfeeling thing, measured by statutes and precedents, not empathy. The morning had been unremarkable so far, routine cases of minor theft and disorderly conduct, none of which moved her in the slightest. She had just handed down a particularly harsh sentence to a first-time offender, a teenage boy who had stolen a few groceries to feed his siblings. His tears and desperate apologies meant nothing to her. The law is the law, she told him coldly before instructing the bailiff to remove him from her courtroom. Her assistant, Margaret Ellis, a woman nearing retirement with gentle eyes and a nervous energy about her, trailed behind, her arms cradling a stack of files. "Your Honor, the Hayes twins are up next. Case 6721. Their public defender is requesting leniency due to their troubled upbringing," Margaret explained softly, her voice training to hide her concern. Troubled upbringing. Susan scoffed as she adjusted her robe, her fingers brushing against the smooth mahogany of her desk. "I'm tired of hearing that excuse, Margaret. Everyone has problems. That doesn't give them the right to break the law. But, Your Honor, they're only 15. This is their first offense. They made their choice when they decided to steal. They should have considered the consequences beforehand." Susan interrupted sharply, her eyes flicking toward the courtroom door. "Let's get this over with." The bailiff's voice boomed through the small, cramped room, announcing the case. The double doors swung open, and two teenage boys were ushered in, their wrists shackled in steel cuffs that seemed too heavy for their slender frames. Joshua and Jordan Hayes, identical twins. Dark-skinned, wide-eyed, their faces etched with a fear that pierced even the most hardened hearts. Except Susan's. Their public defender, a young man named David Cole, stood beside them, his posture tense, his hands trembling as he shuffled his papers. "Your Honor," he began, his voice tight with frustration and worry. "My clients, Joshua and Jordan, are both 15 years old. They were accused of attempting to steal a silver picture frame from Camden Lux, but the truth is, they were there to buy it as a gift for their foster mother. They've worked for months, saving every cent. The store manager assumed they were stealing simply because of their appearance." Susan's gaze hardened, her eyes narrowing. "The police report states that the boys were acting suspiciously. That's enough for me to believe they were up to no good. With all due respect, Your Honor, that's a gross misinterpretation. The store manager's bias." "Bias." Susan's voice was sharp, each syllable cutting like glass. "What matters here are actions, not assumptions of prejudice. We are not here to discuss social injustices. We are here to determine whether or not a crime was committed. But, Your Honor, the only evidence against them is the word of a biased store manager. The boys' money was confiscated as evidence, proving they intended to make a purchase." Susan's jaw clenched. "Enough. You're wasting the court's time." She turned her gaze to the boys. "Do you have anything to say for yourselves?" Joshua stepped forward, his voice trembling but steady. "We were just trying to buy something nice for our foster mom, ma'am. She's taken care of us like her own, and we just wanted to show her how much that means to us. We worked hard for that money. We never stole anything. We didn't even touch the frame." Susan's cold expression didn't waver. "Regardless of your intentions, you caused a disturbance. You should have known better than to act in a way that would raise suspicion. Ignorance is not an excuse. But Jordan's protest was cut short by a stern glare from the judge. Silence. I will not have my authority questioned by a pair of juvenile delinquents, she snapped. You should be grateful you're only being charged with attempted theft and disorderly conduct. I could push for harsher penalties if I felt so inclined. Jordan's shoulders slumped, his gaze dropping to the floor. The weight of her words crushed any hope he'd held on to. Susan reached for her gavel, her fingers gripping the polished wood like a weapon. I hereby sentence you both to 3 months in juvenile detention. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even Margaret's breath hitched. The boy's lawyer began to speak, his voice rising with urgency. Your Honor, please. This is an injustice. They didn't even. Enough. Susan barked. I have made my decision. The twins stared at her, their expressions numb with shock and disbelief. But then Jordan's fear turned to rage, his fists clenched at his sides. You're just doing this because we're black, aren't you? He spat, his words trembling with fury. Susan's eyes widened. How dare you? Before she could finish, her hand jerked forward with anger, slamming the gavel against her desk. But the force of the blow was too hard, too uncontrolled. The polished wood slipped from her grasp and flew forward, striking Jordan squarely on the forehead. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull thud that echoed through the courtroom. Jordan crumpled to the floor, his brother's horrified scream piercing the silence. Gasps filled the room as Susan froze, her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Her face turned pale, her eyes wide with shock at what she had just done. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the world was about to learn just how deeply she had fallen. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and condemnation. The courtroom incident spread like wildfire, igniting outrage across the nation. News channels, social media platforms, and protesters alike dissected every detail of what had happened, replaying the video footage of the gavel flying from Judge Susan Whitmore's hand and striking Jordan Hayes in the forehead. The sound of his body collapsing to the floor became a haunting refrain in the court of public opinion. The footage had been recorded by a reporter present that day, and within hours, the clip was shared millions of times, under hashtags like #JusticeForJordan and #SystemisinJustice. People from all walks of life expressed their horror at the cruelty displayed by a woman who was supposed to uphold fairness. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the city, demanding her resignation. For the first time in her career, Judge Susan Whitmore found herself on the other side of judgment. She tried to carry on with her duties as if nothing had happened, but the calls for her removal grew louder with each passing day. The courthouse became a fortress, surrounded by crowds wielding signs that read, "Justice isn't blind, it's corrupt," and "No more blood on the bench." Susan's superiors scrambled to contain the scandal, but the damage was already done. Public figures, celebrities, and political activists added their voices to the outrage. And in the middle of it all were Joshua and Jordan Hayes, two teenage boys whose lives had been upended by a single moment of unchecked rage. Jordan had been rushed to the hospital immediately after the incident. The gavel had left a deep gash on his forehead, requiring stitches and leaving a scar that would likely be permanent. The psychological trauma, however, cut even deeper. Joshua refused to leave his brother's side, his eyes red from days without sleep, his fists clenched with a simmering anger that had nowhere to go. Their foster mother, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, was a kind woman in her 60s who had taken them in when no one else would. She held their hands as tears streamed down her face, whispering apologies she didn't owe and promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The boys had been failed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The world now knew who Judge Susan Whitmore was, and they hated her for it. Her own family had distanced themselves, her friends avoided her calls, and her colleagues refused to meet her gaze. She became a pariah almost overnight. Still, she clung to the belief that she had acted within her rights, that the boys had shown disrespect to her court and had to be punished accordingly. But late at night, When the silence crept in, and all she could hear was her own breathing, doubt clawed at her. Had she gone too far? Had she been too harsh, too consumed by her own arrogance to see the truth? She drowned those thoughts in work, burying herself under case files and legal documents. But the weight of public scrutiny made every word blur together, every sentence an accusation. Her once pristine reputation now lay in tatters, and for the first time in her life, she couldn't control the narrative. Then came the lawsuit. David Cole, the public defender who had represented the Hayes twins, filed a case against Judge Whitmore, not only for the injuries inflicted on Jordan, but for the blatant abuse of power that had led to the tragedy. His fiery passion in the courtroom, once dismissed by Susan as youthful idealism, now became a force that threatened to end her career. The media ate it up. Interviews with David painted him as a hero fighting for justice in a broken system. And the more he spoke, the more Susan's name was dragged through the mud. But even worse than the lawsuit were the phone calls. Hate-filled messages left on her office voicemail, threats scrawled across the courthouse steps, and letters stuffed into her mailbox with words that dripped with malice. One letter, however, stood out from the rest. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, addressed to her with neat, careful handwriting. Inside was a simple note. The same gavel you used to destroy their lives will be the one to ruin yours. Justice is not yours to wield like a weapon. It's meant to protect the innocent. Susan stared at the note for hours, the words looping endlessly through her mind. They were meant to frighten her, to unnerve her. But what unsettled her most was that somewhere deep inside, she wondered if they were true. Days bled into weeks, and the trial against her drew near. Her lawyers advised her to prepare a formal apology, to show remorse and humility. But Susan's pride wouldn't allow it. She refused to admit she was wrong, even as the world demanded her surrender. But her stubbornness only made things worse. Her own legal team began to doubt her innocence, their commitment to her case wavering under the onslaught of public outrage. And then, in the most unexpected twist of all, Susan's own house caught fire. It happened on a night when the rain poured down like a vengeful storm, lightning splitting the sky as if the heavens themselves raged against her. Susan was jolted awake by the acrid scent of smoke and the searing heat that crept through her bedroom door. Panic surged through her veins as she stumbled out of bed, coughing and choking on the thick black smoke. Flames licked the walls of her hallway, their ravenous hunger devouring everything in their path. She screamed for help, her voice tearing from her throat as she tried to navigate the inferno that had once been her home. The world blurred around her, shadows twisting and writhing in the orange glow of destruction. Susan collapsed to her knees, her strength dwindling as the fire closed in. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. All she could do was whisper a desperate plea to whatever higher power might still be listening. And then, through the smoke and chaos, she heard voices, young voices, shouting her name. The very last voices she ever expected to hear. Susan's world was an inferno of chaos and agony. Her vision blurred from the searing heat, her throat burning from inhaling the toxic smoke that filled her once pristine home. Every corner she stumbled toward seemed engulfed in ravenous flames, greedily devouring her life's work and cherished possessions. The fire had spread faster than she could comprehend. In the confusion, all she knew was that she had to survive. That primal instinct had overridden everything else. Her pride, her regrets, her reputation. None of it mattered if she couldn't make it out alive. But then she heard it. Those voices. "Susan, where are you? Hold on, we're coming." She thought it was a hallucination at first, a cruel trick of her own mind breaking under the pressure. But the voices grew louder, clearer, young, desperate voices. Her knees scraped against the hardwood floor as she dragged herself toward the sound, her fingers digging into the carpet as if the fabric alone could save her. The smoke was thick, the flames roared like living creatures, their heat nearly unbearable. And then, out of the suffocating darkness, two figures emerged. Joshua and Jordan Hayes, the same twins she had condemned in her courtroom. The same boys the world had watched her strike down in a moment of reckless anger. They were here, risking their lives to save her. What are you doing?" Susan croaked, her voice shredded and broken. "Saving your life, even if you don't deserve it," Joshua shot back, his voice tight and trembling. But his grip on her arm was firm, resolute. Beside him, Jordan's eyes shone with terror and determination as he grabbed her other arm. "Come on, we have to get you out of here," Jordan shouted, his voice strained as he coughed against the thick smoke. His forehead bore the scar she had inflicted, a reminder of her cruelty, and yet here he was, putting himself in danger to save her. They half-dragged, half-carried her toward the front door, their youthful strength somehow defying the choking heat and blinding flames. Susan's body felt heavy, her legs refusing to cooperate, but the boys did not give up. The world outside was a blur of flashing lights and frantic shouts. Firefighters rushed toward them, their shouts merging with the screaming sirens. But all Susan could feel was the cold rain pelting her face as she collapsed onto the grass, her body heaving with painful, shallow breaths. Joshua and Jordan released her, their chests heaving as they gasped for air. Despite their own exhaustion, they refused to leave her side until the paramedics reached her. As she lay there, drenched and shaking, Susan stared at them with eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. "Why? Why did you help me?" she managed to whisper. Jordan looked away, his jaw clenched, the scar on his forehead gleaming under the harsh glow of the emergency lights. Joshua, however, stared straight at her, his gaze fierce and unwavering. "Because we're not monsters. And maybe, just maybe, we wanted to show you what real justice looks like," Joshua said. His words cut deeper than any gavel, any verdict, any scorn the world had thrown at her. For the first time, Susan was stripped bare of all her defenses. She had no authority to hide behind, no reputation to shield her from the truth. These boys, the ones she had tried to crush under the weight of her arrogance, had shown her a mercy she hadn't deserved. The paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, her body trembling more from shame than from the effects of the fire. As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, she craned her neck to look back at Joshua and Jordan. They were standing there, drenched from the rain, their faces pale but resolute. For a moment, Susan could see the exhaustion etched into their features, the weight of their own struggles carried with a strength she had never acknowledged before. In that instant, something within her shifted. The bitterness, the anger, the self-righteousness, everything she had clung to for so long felt like a poison she could no longer stomach. Susan closed her eyes as the ambulance doors shut, her mind replaying those words over and over. Because we're not monsters. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Susan's thoughts spiraled between guilt and revelation. The fire had destroyed her home, but something else had been burned away as well. Her arrogance. The stubborn belief that she had been above reproach, above consequence. Days passed. Her body healed quickly, but her mind was left in ruins. The fire had been ruled as an accident caused by faulty wiring, but Susan couldn't help but wonder if it was a sign, a punishment, or maybe an opportunity. In her hospital bed, she replayed the footage of that day in court. The way her eyes had gleamed with fury, the way her gavel had struck Jordan. How had she allowed herself to fall so far from the principles she claimed to uphold? One morning, she picked up her phone with trembling hands and dialed a number she had memorized from the court records. It rang several times before a weary voice answered. "This is Joshua." It's Susan Whitmore." The silence that followed was deafening. She could feel his anger through the line, the disdain he had every right to feel. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold. "I wanted to thank you for saving my life, and to apologize. I was wrong. I was so wrong, Joshua." Her voice cracked, and she let the words spill out, unfiltered, raw. "I've spent my life believing that authority made me righteous, but what I did to you and your brother was unforgivable. You were just trying to defend yourselves, and I lashed out. I hurt you, and I nearly destroyed your life." Joshua's breathing was uneven, his hesitation palpable. "I don't expect forgiveness," she continued, "but I needed you to hear me say it. I'm sorry." A long pause stretched between them. When he finally spoke, his words were quiet, measured. "I'll talk to Jordan. Maybe he'll be willing to hear you out." "Thank you," Susan whispered, her tears flowing freely now. "Thank you." She hung up, her chest tight, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. Because for the first time, she had spoken the truth, and for the first time, she was willing to face the consequences of her own actions. The days following the phone call were restless ones. Susan found herself staring at the sterile white ceiling of her hospital room, her mind circling around what she had done and what she needed to do. Apologizing to Joshua had been like bearing her soul before a firing squad, yet the relief she felt afterward was undeniable. For once, her conscience wasn't shrouded in cold rationalizations. The doctor released her with a cautionary warning about stress and a prescription for painkillers she didn't plan to take. As she stepped out of the hospital, the sun's brightness was overwhelming. Even the warmth felt foreign, as if she didn't deserve its gentleness. Returning to what remained of her home was worse. The mansion, once a symbol of her power and influence, now stood as a charred reminder of everything she had built on broken principles. The insurance company had already begun their assessments, and reconstruction was planned. But Susan didn't care about rebuilding her house. What haunted her was the idea of rebuilding herself. Weeks passed. She buried herself in research, poring over every case she had ever presided over, scrutinizing her own biases, her own judgments. The reflection was brutal, every moment forcing her to confront the ugly truth of her own arrogance. But her guilt wasn't the only thing driving her. There was something else, an insistent need to see those boys again, not just to apologize, but to do something right, to make amends, if that was even possible. The day she finally worked up the courage to visit them was cold and unforgiving. The wind bit at her skin as she stood outside the rundown apartment complex they called home. She hesitated for several minutes before knocking on the door. It creaked open, revealing Jordan's wary face. The scar on his forehead was healing, but the damage went far deeper. His eyes widened when he saw her, suspicion flaring instantly. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharper than broken glass. I came to talk. If you'll let me," Susan said, her voice trembling under the weight of his hostility. "And to listen. I owe you that much." Jordan scoffed. "You owe us a lot more than that." "I know." She lowered her gaze, her shame suffocating her. "And I'm here to try to make things right, whatever that means to you." There was a pause, then the door opened wider. Joshua appeared beside his brother, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. They stepped aside, giving her room to enter. The apartment was small, barely enough space for the necessities. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the air carried the stale scent of neglect. But it was clean, orderly, a clear testament to the boys' resilience. Susan took a seat on the tattered couch, her gaze flicking nervously between the two boys who stood before her like sentinels guarding their own dignity. "I'm not going to pretend that a single apology will erase what I did to you," she began, her voice trembling. "But I need you to understand that I was wrong. Not just about you, but about so many things. I abused my power because it made me feel superior, because I thought authority meant being untouchable, but I see now that it only made me blind." The brothers exchanged a glance, their expressions hard but listening. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Susan continued. "I'm asking you to help me be better. And if you'll let me, I want to help you too. Not out of pity, but because it's the right thing to do. Because you showed me mercy when I showed you nothing but cruelty." Jordan's gaze was icy. "You think showing up here and saying a few nice words is going to fix anything? You can't just hit us and then pretend it's all okay because you feel bad about it now." "I know," Susan replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But I can't just walk away without trying to make things right. Please, just tell me how. Tell me what I can do to even start making this up to you." Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. Joshua looked at Jordan, his expression conflicted. Finally, Joshua spoke, his voice low and careful. "You can't undo what you did, but you can use your power to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. You spent years judging people like us without even knowing us. You need to change the system that lets people like you get away with that." Susan nodded, her fingers clenching into fists as she absorbed his words. "I will. I swear to you, I will. But can I at least help you now? With whatever you need?" Jordan's expression faltered, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something more vulnerable. "We need a place to live. A place where we don't have to worry about being thrown out if we can't pay rent 1 month. Somewhere stable, somewhere safe." Susan's breath caught. The request was so painfully simple, so basic a human need. And yet, it was a mountain these boys had been forced to climb every day. "I can do that," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll find you a home. And not just for now, but for as long as you need." Joshua narrowed his eyes. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because it's the least I can do. Because I need to prove to you and to myself that I can be better. And because I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay." The brothers exchanged a long, silent conversation through their eyes. Finally, Joshua nodded, the tiniest glimmer of hope breaking through his guarded expression. "All right," he said. "But if you're lying to us, if you're just doing this to make yourself feel better, then you'll never hear from us again." "I understand," Susan replied. "But I promise you, I won't fail you this time." For the first time since they met, Susan saw something other than pain or anger in their eyes. It was hope. Fragile, reluctant, but real. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that redemption wasn't just a dream. Susan threw herself into the task with an intensity that left her sleepless for nights. She made calls, sorted through properties, and leveraged every contact she still had. But she didn't do it blindly this time. Instead of assuming she knew what was best, she brought Joshua and Jordan into the process. They met several times over the next week. At first, the boys were suspicious of her motives, their answers clipped and distrustful. But as they realized she wasn't dictating the terms, that she genuinely wanted their input, their resistance softened. The moment Susan showed them the modest but comfortable house she had secured on the quiet edge of town, she saw something remarkable. Jordan's tough exterior cracking just slightly, his gaze sweeping over the place with an emotion he fought hard to keep hidden. "It's yours," Susan said, her voice calm, steady, no strings attached. "The house is paid off, the bills will be covered. It's safe, it's warm, and it's yours for as long as you want it." Joshua looked at her, his eyes searching hers for deception. "Why? Why would you do this for us?" "Because I should have done something like this a long time ago," she replied. "Because I owe you more than I can ever repay. And because," she hesitated, her voice thickening, "because if someone hurt my child the way I hurt you, I would want them to do everything in their power to make it right." The brothers exchanged a glance, their guarded expressions slipping momentarily into something raw and unspoken. The first few weeks in the new house were awkward at best. Susan visited regularly, bringing groceries and anything else they might need. At first, the boys refused her help, but slowly their resistance crumbled under the weight of her persistence. More than once, Susan caught Jordan watching her with a look she couldn't quite decipher. It was as if he was waiting for her to fail, to reveal that all of this was nothing more than a cruel trick. But she didn't fail. Not this time. Instead, she reached out to local organizations that helped underserved communities, making anonymous donations and pushing for policy changes. She advocated for programs that would make sure boys like Joshua and Jordan wouldn't have to face a world so eager to write them off. Still, she couldn't silence the voice in her mind that whispered relentlessly, "It's not enough. It will never be enough." One afternoon, She arrived at the house with more groceries and found Joshua sitting on the porch steps, his face buried in his hands. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and weary. "Jordan's sick. Like, really sick. I don't know what to do. I can't afford a doctor, and I don't want to lose him." His voice broke on the last word, the fear and desperation cracking through his tough exterior. Susan's heart twisted painfully. Without hesitation, she said, "We're taking him to the hospital. Right now." Joshua hesitated, his mistrust flickering back to life. What if they ask questions? What if they try to take him away from me? "They won't. I'll make sure of it." Her voice was fierce, her resolve unbreakable. The drive to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and panicked silence. Jordan lay slumped in the back seat, his breathing shallow and his skin clammy. When they reached the emergency room, Susan strode to the counter with a kind of authority that dared anyone to question her. "This boy needs immediate medical attention. Now." The staff didn't hesitate. Nurses rushed Jordan away, leaving Susan and Joshua standing helplessly in the antiseptic-lit waiting area. Hours passed, the sterile coldness of the hospital pressing down on them. Joshua paced back and forth, his fingers clenching and unclenching as if trying to strangle his own worry. Susan didn't leave his side. They sat in silence, the kind of silence that spoke of unspoken terror and unending guilt. Finally, a doctor emerged, her expression grim but not hopeless. "He's stable. It was a severe infection. If you'd waited any longer, he might not have made it." The relief that crashed over Joshua was almost violent. He slumped into a chair, his head dropping into his hands as sobs tore through him. Susan placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. "He's going to be okay," she whispered, her own eyes brimming with tears. "You're both going to be okay." Joshua didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. Days later, Jordan was released from the hospital. He was weak but recovering, his appetite slowly returning. Susan continued to visit, her presence becoming less of an intrusion and more of a routine. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jordan spoke up for the first time. "Why do you keep coming back?" he asked, his voice hoarse but genuine. Susan took a deep breath. "Because I can't erase what I did to you, but maybe if I keep trying, I can help you build something better. Something you deserve." Jordan looked away, his jaw clenched. "People like you, they always say they want to help. Then they disappear when things get hard." "I'm not going anywhere," Susan replied. "Even if you hate me forever, even if you never forgive me, I'm not leaving." The silence that followed was heavy, leaden with years of pain and mistrust. But within it, there was also the tiniest thread of hope. Susan left that night knowing she still had a long way to go. But for the first time, she believed that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about proving, through action and sincerity, that she was willing to be better. The weeks that followed were a delicate dance. Susan continued to show up, her efforts unwavering. Some days, she was met with open doors and cautious conversations. Other days, she found herself standing on the porch, her knocks unanswered as if the boys had decided to shut her out. Still, she kept coming, even when it hurt, even when their mistrust sliced through her like shards of glass. Susan didn't just want to make amends. She wanted to build something new, something real. She began tutoring Joshua in subjects he was struggling with at school, his pride and frustration creating a constant push and pull. But she was patient. With each lesson, the tension between them eased, a fragile bond forming where there had once been only bitterness. Jordan, however, remained distant. His sharp remarks and piercing glares were a wall he built around himself, daring anyone to try and break through. Susan respected his boundaries but refused to give up. She spoke to him gently, without expectation, allowing him the space to either let her in or keep her out. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled through the sky, Jordan stood at the edge of the porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Susan had just finished preparing dinner, a meal she had hoped would coax him into sitting at the table with her and Joshua. "Why are you trying so hard?" Jordan asked, his voice rough with suspicion and something deeper. Susan met his gaze, her own steady and unflinching. "Because I was wrong. Because you deserve better. And because I care about you. Both of you." He scoffed, the sound bitter. "You care now. But you didn't care when it mattered." "I can't change what I did," Susan admitted, her voice thick with regret. "But I can change what I do now. And tomorrow. And every day after that." For a moment, Jordan just stared at her, his expression hard and unreadable. Then he turned away, his shoulders tense and his steps heavy as he disappeared into the rain. Days passed, and though Jordan continued to keep his distance, something had shifted. He no longer lashed out with his words or shut himself away the moment Susan arrived. It was a small step, but she clung to it like a lifeline. One night, Susan arrived to find both boys waiting for her. Joshua looked nervous, his fingers twitching against the table. Jordan sat with his arms folded, his expression one of forced indifference. "What's going on?" Susan asked, her voice wary but hopeful. "We need to talk," Joshua said, his eyes darting to his brother before settling on her. "About what happens next." Susan's heart thudded painfully. She nodded and sat down, bracing herself for whatever they had to say. Jordan's voice was the first to break the silence. "You've been helping us, and it's not like we haven't noticed. But you have to understand, people like us, we don't get happy endings. Every time someone says they're going to help, it's only a matter of time before they turn their backs. We've learned to stop expecting anything else." His words were a challenge, laced with hurt and fury. But Susan didn't flinch. She absorbed his pain, let it settle in her chest like an anchor. "I know I can't make you believe me," she said, "but I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. I'm here to do the work, to be here for you, whether you let me in or not." Joshua's eyes shimmered with something like hope. "You're saying you're not going to leave?" "Never," she replied, her voice cracking under the weight of her own conviction. "No matter how hard it gets, I'll be here." Jordan's gaze narrowed. "You want us to believe you've changed? Fine. But if you screw us over again, we're done. For good." "I understand." The days rolled into weeks, and slowly, painstakingly, the pieces began to fall into place. Susan found herself spending more and more time at the house, the boy's presence becoming something she craved rather than merely tolerated. She learned about Jordan's passion for drawing, his sketches full of raw emotion and breathtaking detail. She discovered Joshua's knack for building things, his curious mind always tinkering with broken appliances or discarded scraps. Susan made sure their house was stocked with supplies, sketch pads and pencils for Jordan, tools and materials for Joshua. She didn't force her help on them, only made sure it was there when they were ready to accept it. One afternoon, Susan walked into the house to find Jordan hunched over the kitchen table, sketching furiously. She stood quietly, watching the way his fingers moved, the way his eyes remained focused and intent. "What are you working on?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled but not hostile. "Just something." "Can I see?" For a moment, she thought he would refuse. But then, with a shrug that was more resignation than permission, he slid the paper across the table. It was a portrait. Of her. Only, it wasn't just a drawing of her face. It was an image of her sitting at the table with them, a gentle smile on her lips as she laughed at something Joshua had said. The detail was stunning, but it was the warmth in the sketch that stole her breath. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes misting. "You have real talent, Jordan." He shrugged again, his gaze dropping. "It's just a drawing. It's more than that. It's you. It's how you see the world. And that's a gift." For the first time, Jordan's expression softened. The bitterness that had clung to him like armor seemed to waver, as if he was finally allowing himself to consider the possibility of something better. The journey was far from over. But for the first time, Susan felt like they were all moving towards something that resembled healing.